Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Rene Morales. I'm a curator here at Parrots Art Museum, Miami. Welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce today's lecture, which is meant as an accompaniment to the Speechless project by Bick van der Pol, which is currently on view in the Papper Family Gallery near the entrance of the museum. In the process of conceiving their exhibition, the artists Lisbeth Bick and Jos van der Pol came across a few texts by today's speaker, including a particularly sparkling essay titled Speaking of Animals, in a volume of collected writings called Land and Animal and Non-Animal. This was in the process of researching the current theory on the relationship between humans and animals, and particularly around the issue of language. Today's speaker's work provided an immensely useful and stimulating backdrop for the ideas that the artist ended up pursuing in the installation. So we hope that the lecture will provide a better sense of where they were coming from. Dr. Mitchell Akiyama is a multifaceted Toronto-based composer, artist, and scholar who recently completed his PhD in communications at McGill University with a dissertation that examined the idea of field recording across a variety of disciplines, from biology to folklore to sound art. He has published on a wide array of subjects, from sound art to urban ecology, in journals and magazines including Leonardo Music Journal, Canadian Art Review, Offscreen, Locus Suspectus, and Matrix. A book chapter entitled The Recording That Never Wanted to Be Heard and Other Stories of Sonification, co-written with Jonathan Stern, was recently published in the Oxford Handbook to Sound Studies. In addition to his writing, Mitchell has released over 10 records on such labels as Raster Noten, Sub Rosa, and Alien 8, in addition to work on his own imprint, Interversion Records. He has scored and contributed music to many films and dance performances, and has performed across Europe, Japan, Australia, and North America in concert halls, clubs, art galleries, fallout bunkers, and festivals. Mitchell's artwork was recently featured in the solo exhibition Sound, or The Noise No Writing Can Store, at Gendai Gallery in Toronto. And he has participated in group exhibitions at venues including Vienna Museum of Modern Art, Howard House Gallery in Seattle, and the Signal and Noise Festival in Vancouver. So thank you again for being here today, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell Akiyama.
Hi. Thanks, Renee, for inviting me, and thank you, Anita and Mari, for getting me here. So, and thank you for being here today. When the cat's meat man had gone, the parrot flew off the window on the doctor's table and said, "That man's got sense. That's what you ought to do. Be an animal doctor. Give the silly people up. If they haven't brains enough to see that you're the best doctor in the world, take care of animals instead. They'll soon find it out. Be an animal doctor." "Oh, there are plenty of animal doctors," said John Dolittle, putting the flower pots outside on the windowsill to get the rain. "Yes, there are plenty," said Polynesia, "but none of them are any good at all. Now listen, doctor, and I'll tell you something. Did you know that animals can talk?" "I knew that parrots can talk," said the doctor. "Oh, we parrots can talk in 2 languages, people's language and bird language," said Polynesia proudly. "If I say, 'Polly wants a cracker,' you understand me. But hear this. Kaka, oi, fee, fee." "Good gracious," cried the doctor. "What does that mean?" "That means, 'Is the porridge hot yet?' in bird language." "My, you don't say so," said the doctor. "You never talked that way before." "What would have been the good?" said Polynesia, dusting some cracker crumbs off her left wing. "You wouldn't have understood me at all." "Tell me more," said the doctor, all excited. And he rushed over to the dresser and came back with a butcher's book and pencil. "Now don't go too fast, and I'll write it down. This is interesting, very interesting, something quite new. Give me the bird's ABCs. First, slowly now." And so that was the way the doctor came to know that animals had a language of their own and could talk to one another. And all that afternoon, while it was raining, Polynesia sat on the kitchen table giving him bird words to put down in the book. And then later on, "What is it?" Polynesia asked the doctor, looking up from his book. "I was just thinking," said the parrot, and she went on looking at the leaves. "What are you thinking?" "I was thinking about people," said Polynesia. "People make me sick. They think they're so wonderful. The world has been going on now for thousands of years, hasn't it? And the only thing in animal language that people have learned to understand is that when a dog wags his tail, he means, 'I'm glad.' It's funny, isn't it? You were the first man to talk like us. Oh, sometimes people annoy me dreadfully. Such airs they put on, talking about the dumb animals. Dumb, ha! Why, I knew a macaw once who could say good morning in 7 different ways without once opening his mouth. He could talk in every language, he could talk every language and Greek. An old professor with a gray beard bought him, but he didn't stay. He said the old man didn't talk Greek right and couldn't stand listening to him teach the language wrong. I wonder what's become of him. That bird knew more geography than people will ever know. People, golly. I suppose if people will ever learn to fly like any common hedge sparrow, we shall never hear the end of it." Hugh Lofting, Dr. Dolittle, 1920. PowerPoint glitches, 2016. There's a remarkable diversity of the species-specific means of communication used by the world's animals. If some of the irreducible particularity we find has the consequence of setting off human language from other systems, that is no more surprising than the discovery that other biological specializations lead to equally particular, indeed unique, abilities in many animals. These differences are not a matter of philosophy, theology, or misplaced human sympathies. They are empirical features of nature. We may not be able to take flight by flapping our upper extremities, but we're the only species known that can rationally discuss our inabilities to do so. Stephen Anderson, Dr. Dolittle's Delusion, Animals and the Uniqueness of Human Language, 2004. So today I'm going to begin with parrots, given that just downstairs and down the hall there are 4 parrots in an aviary who have, as I read in the press release, like I actually just saw them for the first time this morning, but the text about the exhibition talks about how they were going to be trained to mimic the wasteland. And in the text accompanying the exhibition, it says, quote, 4 parrots taught to mimic phrases from T.S. Eliot's seminal 1922 poem, The Wasteland. And I'm quoting this text deliberately to emphasize the word mimic, because I think this is an important idea, because the implication, of course, is that these parrots are just mimicking sound. They're not necessarily learning the nuance of the words that they're saying. They've just been trained to reproduce those sounds. So I guess what I'm interested in asking is, what can we get from these birds? And are they, it seems fair to ask, are they basically just sound recording devices? Like, are they just simply capturing sound and then reproducing it without any awareness of the fact of their communicating? And if that's the case, then what does it say, or what does it mean if a parrot parrots back or speaks back to us the text of the wasteland and tells us about an impending environmental collapse or collapse of some kind? Does it mean that they're basically just like a funhouse mirror somehow, reflecting back and distorting and maybe complicating the messages that we're giving to them? So I want to play you this clip to complicate what I'm trying to complicate.
Cognitive biologist Dr. Irene Pepperberg worked with Alex, an African gray parrot, on a project that showed some surprising results.
Now once more, how many green wooden blocks? How many green wooden? 4. Good birdie.
On the tray, what sound is yellow? What sound is yellow?
4.
Or. Very good.
Many parrots can talk, but Alex amazed scientists. Why? Alex knew what he was talking about. Pepperberg designed special tests for Alex because she did not want him to simply repeat or mimic information. She wanted him to answer specific questions.
He can tell me how many. He can tell me what's same, what's different, what color bigger, what color smaller, or what matter bigger, or what matter smaller. How many? 2. 2 is right. Good boy. What color bigger? What color bigger? None. Very good. Okay, good boy. Treat? Yeah. You want to...
Alex was able to identify an object many ways, by color, size, and so on. This shows cognitive abilities similar to those of 4 to 5-year-old humans.
Green. 4. That's right. Good boy.
Alex showed that parrots might be able to communicate and to use basic reasoning. Alex died in 2007. During his life, he learned about 150 words. His last words to Irene were reportedly, "I love you."
So what do we make of that? So in Alex's lifetime, he was said to have, as they were saying in the video, the cognitive abilities of about a 4 or 5-year-old. He had learned concepts such as object permanence. So if you hide an object, Alex would know that it was hidden and that it hadn't disappeared, that it continued to exist. He learned the concept of zero, which is a very, very sophisticated concept that I think comes at around 3 or 4. So what's the difference? Is there a difference between Alex and the parrots in the Bick Vanderpool exhibition in terms of ability, but also in terms of what he can tell us about animal cognition and the possibility of animal communication? And what's interesting is that Irene Pepperberg, she has never actually made the claim that Alex has language. And this is, I won't go into the nuances of the debate about it, but I don't think most scientists are willing to grant him language because of the limited possibilities of him combining these ideas and these sounds together, whereas humans, we are apparently, or we consider ourselves special because we can build infinite sentences and infinite ideas with a limited amount of sounds. So my aim isn't really to convince you that somebody like Steven Anderson, Dr. Dolittle's delusion author, that he's wrong or that he's right. And I'm not trying to convince you that we're on our way to some sort of Dolittlean dream of total transparent communication with all the beings. But I'm also not convinced that it's quite as cut and dried as somebody like Anderson would want to argue. So what I want to try and think about here today is the question of animal language and which presumes intelligence, because that's a connection that has been historically made, that for thousands of years, this is a question that has really helped to structure, in fact, it's been fundamental in structuring how we think of ourselves as human. The whole category or idea of the human it is in a lot of ways totally built on the idea that we have language and animals don't. So I'm going to put, and I also think it's important to point out that it's been a fundamental part of how we structure ethics too. Our ideas about how we should be to each other and also to animals really hinges on this idea between this idea of language and communication. So I'm going to put aside parrots for a little bit, and I'm going to give this really, I'm trying to compress 3,000 years of thought into, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes, so there are big, big gaps. But it's just meant to be a kind of a thumbnail sketch of some of the concerns. So I'm going to drift away from parrots a little bit, and most of the rest of the talk is going to focus more on apes, because that's generally where the conversation has been about, historically and in the present about animal cognition. So the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss famously claimed that animals are good to think with. And that seems pretty obvious even today. You know, we've, up until fairly recently, as John Berger pointed out, we were around animals all the time. They shared our living spaces. They were more than just pets. They were a fact of life, and now they've become abstracted and very distant from us. But even still, little kids, they enact all sorts of different behaviors through the idea of the animal. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and his partner Félix Guattari, they talked about this act of becoming animal that happens very often in human life, and that especially amongst kids, this becoming animal is this way of kind of working out certain social processes. So, for example, we could look at Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, where it's the constancy of the tortoise that teaches us the virtues of persistence and patience, and then it's the obliviousness of the hare that teaches us that the arrogant basically finish last. So the ancient Greek philosophers determined basically what made us human by creating a table of characteristics of characteristics that we have and that animals don't. And so, for example, there's a Greek scholar, John Heath, who puts it in this really wonderful way. Quote, "Man's unique ability to laugh, distinguish good and bad, know God, do geometry, engage in sex at all seasons and with other species, and walk upright, as well as our possession of grammar, shame, and hands." But the most enduring and central one has been, at least since Plato, the idea that humans have logos, or language. And what's important to note, too, and this will become a theme later on, is that for Plato, not all humans had logos. Some humans were impoverished in logos and therefore unable to be philosophers, to love knowledge, to know, which is, of course, consistent with the fact that the Athenians kept slaves. So this idea of denying language or diminishing the sophistication of somebody else's language has historically been a way of not only putting animals outside of the human, but also of taking certain humans outside of the realm or the boundaries of humans who belong. So around the same time, while others were blaming talking snakes for the downfall of humanity. And ironically, in the Bible, it's an animal that convinces Eve to eat of the apple, and therefore bringing about the curse of self-knowledge. And I think this is ironic because it's this idea of self-knowledge, which is a faculty that is only supposedly present or possible for beings who have language, that this characteristic that has gone to define the human is actually first possessed by a snake before a human actually becomes fully human. And it's that, again, this possession of language that really becomes an important part of figuring what the human is for the next 2,000 years. So skip ahead to the Enlightenment, to around, I guess, the 17th century, and the philosopher René Descartes, who's considered to be the founder of a particular type of Western philosophy of rationalism. He had the idea that animals were basically were automata. So he had this famous thought experiment in which he imagined that if you were to create a monkey that was basically indistinguishable from a real monkey, but it was an automaton, it was just a machine, that you could create this monkey, this mechanical monkey, to convince a viewer that it was the real thing, because there were a limited amount of reactions that it could possibly have to any particular phenomenon. Whereas if you were to try and do this with a human, it would be impossible, which obviously sort of points at the Alan Turing's test from the 50s about how you determine whether or not a computer has consciousness. So with a human, the problem is that if you can create a completely convincing human, the human will always respond in these sort of novel, unexpected, and creative ways, whereas the monkey, it's just basically a reaction machine. And this denial of any kind of creative agency to animals is a feature that philosophers are going to kind of continue to parrot for a few hundred years after that. And the thing is that it's obviously quite wrong, but it's really interesting about how wrong it is now in the era in which we're really on the cusp of machines becoming indistinguishable in certain respects from humans. I don't know if you've heard about this, but in the last year or two, the first artificial intelligence program actually beat the Turing test. So we're getting there, for better or for worse. But for Descartes, thought, which was dependent on language, was basically the foundation of our existence. There's the famous Cartesian phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which basically means that it's only through thought that we're able to verify our existence. So, animals who can't think because they don't have language can't verify their existence, therefore they don't exist, sort of. And then we find a really similar logic going through later work. The natural historian Linnaeus, who invented the taxonomical binomial system that we use, so like Homo sapiens, that system of naming things was thanks to Linnaeus. And as he was classifying all beings, he realized that he basically couldn't distinguish between monkeys and humans on just a purely morphological level. So for him, the only way that could really hold or be true was to give human an attribute, or to find in humans an attribute that animals didn't have, and that attribute was language. He described humans as being the only animal that knows itself, that knows about itself knowing, that has a certain ability to reflect on itself. And the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, he talks about how he calls this move that Linnaeus made, he calls this the anthropological machine, and that basically what humans have become in the way that we determine what is and what isn't human is a part of this ongoing process, that we've become these processors of things that are human and not human. And the way that we consistently police and keep our borders checked as humans is to identify the thing that's animal, all the things that are animal within us, and to try and rid ourselves of them, to civilize ourselves, to become sophisticated. But it's also about identifying characteristics that are distinctly human and maintaining those. And we see there are obviously like really, really horrific consequences to this exercise of evacuating the animal. So we could look at, for example, the way that, so one form of this, that this takes often has been the identification of the animal in somebody else, in another group of people that you want to diminish their status to a lesser form of being. Take, for example, this really shocking cartoon from the 1870s. So this is Southern Scenes, The Darwinian Theory Illustrated, and it shows these sort of simian-looking African-American man and boy, and the monkey is pouncing on the African-American boy because he's basically jealous and thinks that he's going to take his job as the organ grinder's pet monkey. Or we could look at this more recent image. I went down a really, really, pardon the pun, but a really dark hole on the internet looking at this stuff. It's just incredible. And then closer to my own personal experience or ethnic background, during the Second World War, Japanese were often figured in propaganda as monkeys, for example. So again, going from the 18th century, fast forwarding to the 19th century, another important moment in this bizarre history of language and humanity and animality came when the skeleton of what would be called Java man or Pithecanthropus erectus, but also known as Homo habilis, was discovered. And it was this German scientist named Ernst Haeckel who called this creature Homo habilis because he had already theorized that there had to be an intermediating species in between the apes and humans that wouldn't be able to talk. And so this is important because, well, first of all, finding the skeleton sort of validated this idea that that there had to be this missing link between humans and between apes and humans, and that this was a non-speaking stage. And what's bizarre about it is that he basically had to invent this non-human category to create the idea of the human. And then the next highlight, I'd move to this, the subject that I guess I probably spent the most time with, who is this man named Richard Lynch Garner, who called himself a simian linguist. He was a really interesting guy. He didn't have any formal training in science, but he was a devotee of Charles Darwin, and he was really convinced that monkeys had language. And so in order to prove this, he basically invented this experiment that is still used today, 100 years later, called the playback experiment. And so what he did was he took a phonograph and brought it to a monkey cage at a zoo, and he basically just annoyed the monkey until it would make sounds. And he recorded these sounds to the phonograph, and then he took the phonograph to a different cage with different monkeys and played the sounds back to them. And he was convinced that he saw the monkeys recognizing speech. So he was convinced that they had language. But the thing is, at that time, especially with Garner's particular understanding of how Darwinian evolution worked, his takeaway from that was basically that, yes, monkeys have language, but that human language, and for him, human would have meant European, probably more or less male. It would have a very particular connotation, that there was this continuum between basically going from the apes through the primitive savage races, as he would have probably called them, up to European speakers of European languages. And what I did in the work I've been doing on this was I thought it would be really interesting to take this similar experiment and to trace it into more or less into the present 100 years later. And I actually learned about this experiment through, I don't know if you guys know the podcast Radio Lab. It's a really fantastic and wonderful science podcast on NPR. And well, I'll set this up a little bit just because I don't want to play too much of it, and it helps to understand the context. So this same experiment, this playback experiment that Richard Garner did in the 1890s, this scientist named Klaus Zuberbuehler, he did this experiment in the 1990s. So he would record animals and monkeys in the Thai forest in Côte d'Ivoire, and then he would play these sounds back into the forest canopy, and he would make predictions about what particular sounds would mean. So, if he heard ooh, 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 ah, ah, instead of ooh, ah, ah, oh, ooh, he could predict that the monkeys would either look up or look down because they were alarm calls that would signify like an eagle coming down to crush the monkey's skull with its talon, or a leopard from below. So this is what he's talking about in this clip.
I was working in the forest.
He had gone out for the day, and he had gone out alone.
And was very far away from camp.
And it was in the late afternoon, and he realized that he should probably be heading back to camp.
Because I still had to walk for, something like 15, 20 kilometers back to camp.
And he was walking past a kind of valley.
And then I heard on the other side of the valley a monkey group giving leopard alarm calls, which doesn't happen that often.
It was the first time that he wasn't actively listening, but he heard these monkeys make this call and recognized it.
It was absolutely striking
And he was actually quite excited by this.
because I was suddenly able to understand what the monkey's trying to say, so to speak.
Those monkeys had picked up a leopard.
Right beneath that sound, there the leopard would be.
Right. But you know, those monkeys were way across the valley.
So I didn't really think that much and walked on, perhaps, half a mile further down the road.
And the next group of Diana monkeys, still across the valley,
Started giving leopard alarm calls as well.
and he kind of took notice of that. And then it happened a third time, a few minutes later.
What became clear to me very rapidly is that a leopard was,
Tracking him.
of course I couldn't see it because it was, dense forest, but I assumed that the leopard saw me. And of course that, is just one of these moments where you're totally alone, far, far away from camp.
What does he do?
He kept walking. It happened a fourth group called leopard, a fifth group called leopard. And then the group stopped calling.
The only thing I could think of is to pick up, a large branch.
I shouldn't laugh. That's just terrifying.
Klaus, would that stick have done anything for you?
I doubt I really would have been able to do very much with a stick.
But as he's standing there, stick in hand, he realizes he's just entered the forest. He's become,
The 11th primate.
The 11th primate.
because there are those 10 other species of primate, and now
Me. Suddenly, I shifted from being the objective observer to being, sort of part of that whole crowd in there. Even though, we're separated by 20, 30 millions of years of evolutionary history, these humble creatures, were able to teach me something about what was going on in the forest. And I mean, of course, it wasn't intentional. They weren't trying to inform me or anything like that. But it was a very emotional experience.
So let's contrast that with Garner. I mean, it's important to note that Zubabiru at the end says that they weren't intentionally trying to tell him this. But whereas Garner saw evidence of the superiority of Western Europeans, even though he was willing to admit the animals and apes closer to humanity, we find a scientist 100 years later basically admitting that he feels like he's become a member of a forest community of primates, which is totally fascinating because you never hear scientists speak like that, or you never see them write like that, certainly in publication, that there's no way that would happen. But it seems like a kind of a strange thing for the representatives of objectivity and empiricism to be saying things like this. But then if you think about all of the stuff that happened in the 20th century, it may not be quite as surprising. Just to give a few examples, there's this story that Jane Goodall tells, where she was observing chimpanzees, and she watched as a chimpanzee stripped a branch of bark and of its leaves, and then dipped it into an ant or a termite mound, and the termites would latch onto the branch, and the chimp pulled the branch out and basically used it as a serving stick for the termites. And of course, one of the ways in which the human has been defined historically is as the tool-making animal, Homo habilis. And so this was a major upset to this idea of tools as being a particularly exclusive feature of the human species. And so she famously telegrammed this finding to the anthropologist Louis Leakey, who was kind of her advisor. And he said, I wish I'd written it down, it's something like, either we need to redefine either we need to come up with a new definition for tool, a new definition for chimpanzee or a new definition for man, because that gesture basically changed everything. But also, a lot of things have started to become less than abstract and less than sort of speculation about, for example, how 90% of our biomass of our body contains matter or cells that doesn't have our DNA. So we are only 10% us. This is stuff that philosophers have been theorizing for a really long time, but it's basically being borne out scientifically and empirically now. So it's maybe not as surprising as it might seem at first to have a scientist learning how to recognize certain signifying gestures in a monkey species, and then himself feeling this becoming animal, that sort of along the lines of what I was talking about before. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Dolittle here, because Dr. Dolittle forms a really nice kind of bookend, I think, for this talk. And I think you'll see why.
Out here. Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Oh my God.
Hello. Ooh, that's right. You're the one who can hear us, aren't you?
No, I'm not hearing anything. I can't hear you.
The whole woods are talking about you, you know? Listen, can you do me a favor? Can you just take this stick out of my wing? It's killing me. Can ya, huh? Don't worry, I won't hurt you. Ah, much better. Good job. Thank you.
What's happening to me?
You're going to be pleasantly surprised, that's what. Oh my goodness, it's an owl.
Yeah, it's a big nasty owl. Let's go in the house, man.
Beautiful.
No, they're very dangerous creatures.
Oh, no, they're
Oh,
not.
yes, they are. They can poke your eye out now.
Oh, come
Yes,
on.
they can poke your eye out very easily. Hey, take your finger off, all of that.
What you doing messing with that owl?
Go get in the bed. I'm gonna go check on Sharice and Maya and make sure everything is all right. And I want to lock the door.
Are you okay?
I'm fine, you know.
Are you sure?
Go ahead, get to bed, please.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Hey, crazy man, I know you having fun in there. Do a little dance, make a little love. Get down tonight. Get down
Can I make a request? Can I get tuna and oil instead of water?
Hey,
This
who put
definitely
in that
tastes
bug
like
zapper?
tap water, not spring
Boule,
water.
boucouche, I say soir. Say soir. I'm nasty.
Yo, looky here. Hey, buddy, my old lady ass, I've been eating trash all night. You dig?
Yeah, you're on my tail, you idiot.
Got to lose that bug light. Hey, I know you can hear me.
Hey, Doc, while you're out, get some salmon. You can't go wrong with salmon.
Hey, buddy, all night.
You broke Mr. Stinky, I think.
Keep away from me!
John, what are you doing?
I have to go back to the city, honey.
What? Wait, John, why? John, you just got here.
I know, but I need a doctor. I mean, I am a doctor, and I got beef, so I gotta go back to the city, because when you get beef, you gotta go. I'm very sorry, honey. I'll talk to you later. I love you so much! So it may seem like I lost a dare or something to try and include Eddie Murphy and Descartes in the same talk, but I tried to sample all the flavors of Dolittle, and what I find really fascinating about this particular clip, or about this film, which is not a great film, in my opinion, is that, well, for one thing, the animals speak to him in English, which is very different. So in the book, Dolittle learns to speak the language of the animals. He learns fish, he learns goat, he learns, and this is true of the 1967 version as well with Rex Harrison. There's this really funny scene where he's next to an aquarium with fish, and he's blowing bubbles into the aquarium, and there's another human in the room with him, and they ask him what he's doing, and he says, oh, I'm learning to speak fish. but they're really upset with me because my bubblers are so big and violent, they think I'm yelling at them. And so I'm going to try and probably unfairly put too much philosophy into Eddie Murphy and Dr. Dolittle, but one thing that's really interesting about the film is that when Eddie Murphy's a kid, he has this gift to understand animals, and then his dad basically shames him out of it, and he represses this for the rest of most of his life until he has an accident and hits his head, and then it comes back to him. And so once this gift comes back to him that he can understand the animals, all of a sudden, all the animals recognize that he recognizes that he recognizes. So his recognition of their intelligence kind of frees up the entire community of beings to participate in one conversation. And I think, so the fact that they all speak English probably didn't have any, particularly philosophical underpinnings or motivations. My guess is probably they were like, whoa, we got this CGI technology that can make a skunk move its mouth and sync to English. Also, I think it was probably a really kind of crass opportunity to get as many stars to have cameos as possible, because it's kind of crazy how many really famous celebrities were voicing these animals. But yeah, there's something that kind of unintentionally utopian, I think, about every creature speaking the same language. And I think that's kind of what people who want animals to have language are sort of asking or expecting, is this possibility of a future utopia of everything living in harmony. And I'm not sure that is necessarily realistic or even useful, because I think what it does in a way, unfortunately, is sort of paper over the unbelievable complexity and diversity of life. That we're basically enforcing a bizarre and probably not all that useful standard to expect that all other creatures need to demonstrate human intelligence and human capacity for language in order to be admitted to our version of ethics and of morality. Because we could easily look to the complexity of phenomena that are just absolutely alien to us, like, for example, ants. That ants can create the organization and the structures that they can when each given ant really has no fundamental ability to orchestrate or to actually execute any of these things. They only create these structures that, on a ratio of their body to the scale of the structure, would be unimaginable on a human scale. They do this through, the property's called emergence. So there's the postulation that there's this intelligence that kind of works above the ants, that ants coming into conjunction with each other form a group intelligence that is much bigger than the sum of the individual capacities of those ants. So that seems absolutely alien, and it is, except that that's what we do all the time too. The philosopher Friedrich Engels, who collaborated with Marx on the Communist Manifesto, he noticed this in Manchester during the Industrial Revolution, that there was this organization in Manchester that was far more sophisticated than any sort of central planning could have ever managed. So I think that we can look to these seemingly alien capacities, and sometimes they're actually not so dissimilar from our own capacities and our own tendencies as they might seem at first. But to me, that's where the radical gesture of not inclusion, but of collaboration, I guess, would be. And that opens up a way of thinking about ethics and intelligence and human and non-human in ways that are much more complicated than just sort of using our own characteristics as the standard by which to admit or not admit other creatures. There's a famous and really enigmatic quotation by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said, "If a lion could speak, we could not understand what it's saying." And I think that's kind of a coda and a really interesting way of thinking about this problem that we want animals so badly to speak. We want to be able to communicate with them, but even if they could speak, would the physical experience and the sensory apparatuses of most other creatures are so different from our own that could we ever really, and we have a hard enough time understanding each other when we've got, most of us have a similar amount of limbs and eyes and things. So anyway, I wanted to close by coming back to this idea of bridges and of language being this potential bridge between the human and the non-human. I'm going to go back to Dolittle again because I couldn't pass up this passage. It's just so metaphorically and literally perfect. "Oh dear," said Gub-Gub, "the king's men are quite close now." Dolittle and his companions have gone to Africa, and they're being chased through the forest by the African king. "The king's men are quite close now. Look at them. I'm afraid we are going to be taken back to prison again." And he began to weep. But the big monkey who was carrying the pig dropped him on the ground and cried out to the other monkeys, "Boys, a bridge! Quick, make a bridge! We've only a minute to do it. They've got the captain loose, and he's coming like a deer. Get lively, a bridge, a bridge." The doctor began to wonder what they were going to make a bridge out of, and he gazed around to see if they had any boards hidden any place. But when he looked back at the cliff, there hanging across the river was a bridge all ready for him, made of living monkeys. For while his back was turned, the monkeys, quick as a flash, made themselves into a bridge, just by holding hands and feet. And the big one shouted to the doctor, walk over, all of you, hurry." Gub-Gub was a bit scared, walking on such a narrow bridge at that dizzy height above the river, but he got over all right, and so did all of them. John Dolittle was the last to cross, and just as he was getting to the other side, the king's men came rushing up to the edge of the cliff. Then they shook their fists and yelled with rage, for they saw they were too late. The doctor and all his animals were safe in the land of the monkeys, and the bridge was pulled across to the other side. Then Chi-Chi turned to the doctor and said, "Many great explorers and gray-bearded naturalists have lain long weeks hidden in the jungle, waiting to see the monkeys do that trick. But we never let a white man catch a glimpse of it before. You were the first to see the famous Bridge of the Apes." And the doctor felt very pleased. Thanks. So I think there's time for some questions if you have anything that you'd like to ask or interject or argue.
And we're recording today, so if you could just wait for us to get the mic to you.
And there are two mics, so two people could speak at the same time. Or we could bring a mic down to the Parrots.
While we're waiting, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Alex and the debate about language.
Sure, yeah. So from the perspective of linguistics, it's pretty easy to argue that Alex doesn't have language because basically the proposition is that there's a sort of deep inherent biological structure to our brains that allows the possibility of our generating language and novel sentences that reflect novel ideas. And the argument is that Alex has basically just learned these sort of conditioned responses. So the phenomena he's responding to are much more complex than just sort of like poke, ouch, or I'm hungry, roar, or which is where the bar has kind of always been set for animals, that animals just react. They've got this like repertoire. It's as though there's, say, 30 buttons, and that you do thing X to the animal and you press button 2 and that sound comes out, because they're reaction machines. So the argument is basically Alex is just kind of executing a more sophisticated chain of operations. Nobody would, I think, argue that he understood what he was saying. But then you could kind of flip that argument and say, how much do any of us ever understand what we're saying? I don't know if anybody has this experience ever. It's almost like aphasia, where you say a word and you know what it means, but the sense just isn't right or something. That there's this, I don't think that we're connected to our language nearly as deeply as we want to believe. So I think there are always ways of complicating those kinds of, I wouldn't commit to animals having language. I also wouldn't commit to them not having language. And that's because I sort of waive my right to have to make that decision or judgment, because it seems too alien and complicated to me. I mean, there's a really great book by actually a media scholar named John Durham Peters, and he writes about dolphins and how dolphins communicate. And he does this really rigorous attempt to think about what it's like to be a dolphin. So what is your life like? What's communication like if your medium is water and not air? And if your medium basically filters light out most of the time. So the types of communications that are possible are kind of at least partially conditioned by your environment. So we're not aqueous creatures. We can have no idea what it means to be a dolphin. And a parrot can't know what it means to be a human. So I guess that's why I'm saying that to only really attribute or accord ethical responsibility to animals once they've demonstrated their capacities to be kind of human is really problematic, because that's never going to happen. Yes?
I had just kind of another question for the fact that you consider what was the name of the parrot? Alex?
Yes.
There's also another animal that has been in the news for being able to sort of communicate with humans, and that's Coco, the gorilla, that does sign language. And so I was wondering, I understand we've been talking about communication not just verbally, but sort of as an overall thing where one person or one being can be understood by another. But I just was wondering, what are your thoughts on Coco, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Because the thing is, Coco and all the other animals, like Nim Chimpsky, who is a chimp, there's a really, really amazing documentary, and I'm totally blanking on the name, but if you Google Nim Chimpsky, you'll find the documentary pretty. Sorry? Yes, thank you, Project Nim. So the thing with that is, as I understand it, scientists are kind of willing to accord more sophistication to monkeys, to apes, in terms of syntax and kind of a meta-awareness of the fact that they're communicating, and they have more capacity to create novel sentences or novel kind of phrases. What's kind of fascinating about the parrot-monkey thing is that monkeys just don't have the physical apparatus to make those sounds. They're just missing parts of the anatomy that we have that allows us to make the sounds that we make. So that's why they've tried to. There was always the assumption that they potentially had the capacity to demonstrate language, but they just couldn't make the sounds to do it. And so sign language was the best way, or the only way, to see if this was possible. I don't know enough about. There are other experiments where they basically created these sort of iconic languages for touchscreens and stuff, where monkeys could compose sentences not just through sign language, but by combining different symbols on a touchscreen. So, yeah, I don't think, for the most part, I don't think scientists are really willing, again, to grant monkeys language. But that's kind of why I find that Zuberbuehler story so interesting. That, he's really obviously sincere about it. I don't think it's just, and he's got a PhD in psychology or something. He's not He's a pretty rigorous guy, as I understand it. He's published more papers than I'll ever be able to read about this stuff. And to hear him profess that he became a part of a speaking community is really interesting and does some really weird things about where we put the parameters of language, because maybe it's about communicating potentially infinitely complex thoughts, but also maybe communication or language, there's an element to it of just sort of being with another being. And another reference for that idea of just this sort of mutual entanglement and intertwinement that we kind of need to think about for questions of ethics. There's an important scholar named Donna Haraway. She wrote a book called Companion Species Manifesto, but she's one of the great thinkers of human-animal relations. I hope that sort of answers the question a bit.
I think it's very interesting how you talk about the ability for us to make certain noises and the ability to comprehend the noises that other animals are making, because we don't have the apparatuses to create those noises. So I was wondering if you know of any studies that in which we're actually trying to learn the language of another animal, such as, I don't know, a whale or a porpoise, and how computers have developed over time to maybe us to make those noises and to actually communicate with animals, maybe not ourselves speaking, but through another medium or anything like that, or even any study that we've done to actually record these noises and put together a language dictionary for another species.
Right. Yeah. I haven't looked enough into that, but there is this ongoing set of experiments with scientists trying to create a dolphin language interface that will both recognize dolphin sounds and produce them, because I saw something not too long ago about how dolphins have proper names, like they have call patterns for each other that denote a specific individual. It's not just like, hey you, or the way that when we beep our horn to say I'm here. I think that's kind of always been the way that we've conceived of if animals actually sort of recognize each other in the true sense of recognition, like recognizing the act of the potential for cognition. We always thought that they were just kind of beeping a horn at each other, but dolphins apparently are saying, "Hey Jim." So yeah, I don't know enough about that, but I think that is a thing that's happening. Trying to, again, bridge those limitations of physical capacities in order to interface with, like literally interface by using interfaces with other creatures. That is something that's happening for sure. We could talk about something else, about football or Eddie Murphy. Favorite Eddie Murphy movie? Or if there are no more questions, then we can just wrap it up.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Renee.
So as I mentioned in my introduction, you're also a sound artist and a musician. I'm just curious, how did that body of work lead to your investigations into the issue of language and animals, and which one came first, and how does it manifest itself in your other side of producing?
Well, I ended up at animal speech or animal language. So when I started my PhD, I got in with the proposal to do a history of the practice of field recording, which means going out into the field with a microphone and capturing stuff on location rather than in a laboratory or in a studio. And so I started thinking about, and I came to that because I use field recordings in my music and in my sound art and stuff. And I guess I started thinking about the history of the use of field recording, and it started to seem really interesting to me that we even talked about there being a difference between being out there and being in here. And I realized that there were these really complicated political and ideological kinds of things that followed from that distinction. So for example, when we talk about going out into the field, the assumption is that you're in a real place where everything is uncontrolled and authentic and real. And that when you're in a laboratory, in a studio, everything is controlled and sanitized and purged of variables, and that one studio is the same as any other studio, and one lab is the same as any other lab, and therefore you can have these sort of, in a laboratory you can replicate an experiment in Zurich the same way you can do it in Miami, the same way you can do it in St. Petersburg. But if I'm to go out into the Bay right now with a microphone, that's a very different thing from going out into St. Petersburg with a microphone. And so I started thinking about all the ways and fields in which that's done, and I was thinking about the great field recordist Alan Lomax, who made recordings of folk music all over the world, and then I started to realize that he had this really messed up relationship with race. Every time I looked at the way that field recording worked in a different discipline, I started to see all of these things coming out about politics and the way that we understand, the way that we gain understanding of the world and the way that we interpret that understanding and what those kinds of media practices do to those understandings. So it was a kind of a weird relationship between, and yeah, I guess it probably informs my art and music practice somehow. I'm not really quite sure exactly yet. I don't know, maybe I'll make a piece about me trying to talk to a dolphin with a modular synthesizer or something. I know how it's going to turn out already. It's going to be a great conversation.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.